On the morning of April 9, 1943, Soviet Captain Alexander Pokryshkin prepared his P-39 Airacobra fighter for combat operations near Krymskaya in southern Russia. Within hours, he would claim his first victory in an aircraft that American and British Air Forces had deemed unsuitable for frontline service. This moment marked the beginning of one of the Second World War's most significant reversals in aviation history, the transformation of a rejected fighter into one of the Eastern Front's most effective combat aircraft. The P-39's development began in 1937 when Bell Aircraft Corporation responded to United States Army Air Corps specifications for a single-seat interceptor. Lead designer Robert Woods conceived an unconventional configuration. The LS&V 1710 engine mounted behind the pilot's seat, driving a propeller through an extension shaft, running beneath the cockpit floor. This arrangement allowed engineers to install a 37mm automatic cannon firing through the propeller hub, a concentration of firepower unprecedented in American fighter design. Bell's experimental prototype, designated XP-39, completed its maiden flight on April 6, 1938 at Wright Field, Ohio. Initial test results impressed Army evaluators. Equipped with a General Electric turbo supercharger, the prototype achieved 390 miles per hour at 20,000 feet altitude. Climb performance exceeded expectations, reaching 20,000 feet in 5 minutes. The Army Air Corps issued a production contract based on these promising characteristics. However, in June 1939, the Army directed Bell to send the prototype to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics Wind Tunnel Facility at Langley Field, Virginia. NACA engineers were tasked with reducing aerodynamic drag to increase maximum speed. Their analysis identified multiple sources of drag, including the turbo supercharger installation. In August 1939, Bell proposed eliminating the turbo supercharger system entirely, replacing it with a single-stage, single-speed mechanical supercharger integral to the Alaska engine. If you appreciate detailed evidence-based examinations of Second World War aviation history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'd also appreciate hearing from you in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from, whether you're in Texas, Tasmania, or anywhere between. This engineering decision fundamentally altered the P-39's performance envelope. The mechanical supercharger provided adequate boost at sea level and medium altitudes, but could not maintain engine power above 15,000 feet. According to declassified Army Air Forces technical reports, the production P-39's service ceiling was listed at 35,000 feet. But effective combat performance degraded rapidly above 15,000 feet. At 20,000 feet, the fighter's rate of climb decreased to approximately 500 feet per minute, insufficient for intercepting high-altitude bomber formations. For the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces, this limitation proved critical. British Air Defense Doctrine in 1940-41 emphasized intercepting German bomber formations at altitudes between 20,000 and 25,000 feet. The RAF received 675 P-39s designated as Airacobra Mark I. Beginning in July 1941, evaluation by the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford revealed severe deficiencies. Test pilots reported inadequate performance above 17,000 feet. Poor rate of roll compared to the Spitfire, and dangerous spin characteristics when flown with depleted nose ammunition. The center of gravity issue stemmed directly from the unconventional engine placement. With the Alaska-V 1710 mounted behind the cockpit, the aircraft's weight distribution shifted rearward as the 37mm cannon expended its 30-round ammunition supply. Flight test reports documented that the P-39 could enter a flat spin with minimal warning. when flown at high angles of attack with an empty ammunition bay. Recovery procedures were difficult, and several RAF pilots barely avoided fatal accidents during acceptance trials. British squadrons rejected the Airacobra for combat operations. The RAF transferred most of its allocation to training units or placed them in storage. Official Air Ministry assessment reports concluded that the aircraft was unsuitable for operations over Europe and recommended against accepting additional examples. The United States Army Air Forces deployed P-39 and P-400 fighters to the Southwest Pacific Theater beginning in early 1942. The P-400 designation applied to export models originally manufactured for British contracts, but diverted to American use following RAF rejection. These aircraft featured slightly different equipment standards, but identical performance characteristics to USAA AFB-39 variants. The 8th Pursuit Group received P-400s in Australia during March 1942. The 35th, 36th, TH and 80th Fighter Squadrons operated these aircraft from Port Moresby, New Guinea, beginning in April. Combat operations immediately revealed the same high-altitude deficiencies that had caused British rejection. Japanese Navy Type 1 land attack bombers, known to Allied forces as Betty bombers, typically operated at altitudes between 18,000 and 22,000 feet. When conducting raids against Allied positions, according to 5th Air Force mission reports, P-39 and P-400 formations frequently failed to intercept Japanese bomber formations before they reached their targets. The fighters' climb rate at altitude proved insufficient to gain necessary height advantage. When interceptions did occur above 18,000 feet, pilots reported severely degraded aircraft performance. Controlled response became sluggish, maximum speed decreased, and turning performance suffered. Lieutenant Boyd Wagner, who became the first American ace of the warflying P-400, flew several combat missions in P-400s during May 1942. His after-action reports noted that the aircraft handles well at low altitude, but becomes increasingly difficult to control above 15,000 feet. Wagner recommended restricting P-39, P-400 operations to ground attack and low-altitude patrol missions. The 39th Fighter Squadron deployed to Guadalcanal in August 1942, equipped with P-400s. During the critical months of the Guadalcanal campaign, these aircraft flew combat air patrol, ground attack, and limited interception missions. Squadron records document 80 Japanese aircraft claimed destroyed between August and December 1942, against approximately 70 P-400s lost to all causes. This exchange ratio of roughly 1-to-1 was considered inadequate given American industrial capacity and training advantages. Second Lieutenant William Fiedler of the 39th Fighter Squadron became the only American pilot to achieve ace status while flying the P-39. Between January and June 1943, Fiedler claimed 5 confirmed victories to a 6 M0 and 3 D3 A Valdai bombers. His third victory occurred on June 12, 1943, when he intercepted and shot down a Zero fighter approximately 10 miles from Cape Esp. On June 16th, Fiedler claimed to Valdai bombers during a Japanese attack on Allied shipping near Guadalcanal, bringing his total to 5 confirmed victories. On June 30th, 1943, Fiedler was killed in a ground accident at Guadalcanal's fighter strip Puang. AP-38 Lightning, experiencing engine failure during takeoff, crashed into Fiedler's parked P-39 while he sat in the cockpit preparing for a mission. Both aircraft were destroyed by fire. Fiedler died from his injuries shortly after being extracted from the wreckage. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The 37mm M4 cannon, theoretically the P-39's primary weapon, proved problematic in Pacific service. The weapon's slow rate of fire, approximately 140 rounds per minute, combined with its 30-round ammunition capacity, meant pilots had only 12 to 13 seconds of firing time. The cannon jammed frequently in the humid tropical environment. Maintenance records from 5th Air Force units showed that 30 to 40% of P-39s at forward bases had non-functional nose cannons at any given time. By mid-1943, the Army Air Forces began replacing P-39s with P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts as rapidly as these newer fighters became available. The last frontline P-39 fighter squadron in the Southwest Pacific converted to P-38s in October 1943. Remaining P-39s were transferred to training commands or relegated to secondary duties. The Soviet Union received its first P-Airacobras through the Lend-Lease program in late 1941. These initial deliveries consisted of British contractee models shipped via Arctic convoy to more. However, the primary delivery route for American aircraft to the Soviet Union became the Alaska-Siberia air ferry route. Known by its Russian abbreviation ALSIB, this aerial supply line began at Bell Aircraft's manufacturing facility in Buffalo, New York. Newly produced P-39s were flown by ferry pilots to Great Falls, Montana, a journey of approximately 1,800 miles. At Great Falls Army Air Base, aircraft underwent final inspections and modifications for cold weather operations. Female pilots of the Women Air Force Service pilots frequently flew this transcontinental leg. From Great Falls, male Army Air Forces ferry pilots flew the fighters northwest to Ladfield, near Fairbanks, Alaska, a distance of roughly 2,000 miles across western Canada. This segment crossed vast wilderness areas with limited navigation aids and few emergency landing fields. Weather conditions ranged from severe thunderstorms in summer to extreme cold in winter. Achilot-filled American pilots transferred the aircraft to Soviet Air Force ferry pilots who would complete the journey across the Bering Sea to Siberia. This handover point represented a unique aspect of wartime cooperation. Soviet military personnel operated from American territory to receive Lend-Lease aircraft. Soviet ferry pilots faced the most dangerous segment of the journey. Flying single-engine fighters across the Bering Strait meant crossing approximately 50 miles of opaque water, where engine failure would result in death. In water temperatures near freezing, navigation was accomplished using radio beacons and celestial navigation, with twin-engine bombers or transports sometimes accompanying fighter groups to provide navigation assistance. The first Soviet landing point was Markovo Airfield in northeastern Siberia. From there, the route continued west through a series of staging bases: Semtun, Yakutsk, Kerensky, Krasnoyarsk, and finally Krasnoyarsk, where aircraft entered the Soviet military supply system. The complete journey from Buffalo, New York to Soviet operational units could take 6 weeks or more. Weather posed constant hazards. Siberian winters brought temperatures below -60°F. Summer brought fog and limited visibility. Soviet records indicate that approximately 3% of aircraft were lost on the Alsib route due to weather, navigation errors, or mechanical failures. Given that 4,719 P-39s were delivered to the Soviet Union via all routes, with the majority traveling via ALSIB, this suggests losses of approximately 140 aircraft during ferry operations. The logistics of maintaining this supply line required significant resources. American personnel at Lad Field numbered several thousand, including maintenance crews, administrative staff, and liaison officers. Soviet ferry pilots rotated through in groups, spending weeks at American bases while waiting for weather windows and aircraft availability. The tactical environment on the Eastern Front differed fundamentally from air combat conditions in Western Europe and the Pacific. These differences would prove critical in determining the P-39's effectiveness in Soviet service. German Luftwaffe operations over the Eastern Front focused primarily on ground support and battlefield interdiction. Unlike the strategic bombing campaigns against Britain or the defense of German industrial centers, Eastern Front air operations concentrated on supporting ground forces engaged in massive land battles. Tactical bombers such as the Junkers Ru-87, Stuka and Ru-88 medium bomber operated at altitudes between 8,000 and 15,000 feet when attacking Soviet positions. Fighter escort for these bombers remained at similar altitudes. Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters typically patrolled between 10,000 and 18,000 feet when covering bomber formations. High-altitude combat above 20,000 feet occurred infrequently on the Eastern Front compared to operations over Germany, where Allied heavy bombers regularly flew at 25,000 feet or higher. This altitude regime placed most Eastern Front air combat precisely within the P-39's optimal performance envelope. Between 8,000 and 15,000 feet, the Allison V-1710 engine with its single-stage supercharger provided adequate power. The aircraft could achieve speeds of 360 to 375 miles per hour at these altitudes, matching or exceeding the performance of many Soviet and German fighters. Soviet Air Force doctrine in 1941-42 suffered from significant deficiencies that contributed to catastrophic losses during the initial German invasion. Radio communication between aircraft was virtually non-existent. Most Soviet fighters either lacked radios entirely or carried equipment so unreliable that pilots routinely disabled it to save weight. Without radio communication, Soviet fighter formations relied on visual signals. Flight leaders indicated tactical changes through wing movements or other prearranged gestures. This system broke down rapidly during combat when formations scattered and individual pilots lost sight of their leaders. The inability to warn wingmen of threats, coordinate attacks, or call for assistance proved devastating. German fighter pilots exploited this weakness systematically. Luftwaffe formations used radio coordination to set up ambushes, direct multiple aircraft against single targets, and maintain situational awareness. German pilots could warn each other of Soviet attacks, coordinate defensive maneuvers, and concentrate forces at decisive points. Soviet pilots flew blind and deaf by comparison. The P-39's SCR 5-2 radio system represented a revolutionary capability for Soviet fighter units. This vacuum tube radio provided clear voice communication over ranges exceeding 50 miles under good conditions. The equipment was reliable, relatively simple to maintain, and compatible with Soviet ground control stations with minor modifications. For the first time, Soviet fighter pilots could coordinate tactics in real time. Flight leaders could vector individual aircraft toward targets, warn of enemy positions, coordinate attacks, and maintain formation discipline during combat. The psychological impact of being able to communicate with wingmen and receive warnings cannot be overstated. Soviet pilots had operated in radio silence for 2 years. Suddenly, they could fight as coordinated teams rather than collections of individuals. Soviet Air Force ground crews and pilots implemented numerous field modifications to P-39 aircraft based on operational experience. These changes, often unauthorized by American technical standards, optimized the aircraft for Eastern Front conditions. The most significant modification involved removing the wing-mounted .30 caliber Browning machine guns. These weapons, installed in the outer wing panels, fired rifle caliber ammunition with limited destructive power against armored aircraft. Soviet pilots and armorers considered them ineffective and unnecessary weight. Each gun with ammunition weighed approximately 30 pounds, for a total reduction of roughly 60 pounds. Removing these weapons provided several advantages. First, reduced wing weight, decreased the aircraft's moment of inertia around the longitudinal axis, improving roll rate. Test data from Soviet flight research institutes indicated that removing wing guns improved roll rate by approximately 8 to 12%, making the aircraft more responsive in turning combat. Second, eliminating the weapons and their ammunition increased maximum speed by a small but measurable amount. Third, maintenance requirements decreased with fewer weapon systems to service. Soviet pilots retained the nose-mounted armament 137mm M4 cannon firing through the propeller hub and 250 caliber M2 Browning machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. This concentration of firepower along the aircraft's center line improved accuracy compared to wing-mounted weapons, which required bore sighting convergence adjustments. The 37mm cannon, problematic in American service, functioned more reliably under Soviet maintenance practices. Soviet armorers had extensive experience maintaining large-caliber automatic weapons, particularly the 20mm Svika and 23mm Svika cannon used in Soviet fighters. They applied similar maintenance procedures to the American M4 cannon, including more frequent cleaning, careful ammunition inspection, and modified feed mechanisms. Soviet pilots adapted their firing techniques to the cannon's characteristics. Rather than firing long bursts at maximum range, they trained to close to 200 to 300 meters before opening fire. At these ranges, the weapon's low rate of fire and heavy projectile trajectory became less problematic, while the destructive power of 37mm high explosive shells proved devastating. A single hit could destroy most German fighters. 2 or 3 hits would bring down bombers. Other modifications addressed cold weather operations. Soviet mechanics modified fuel systems to prevent fuel line freezing, essential for operations in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Engine preheating systems were installed using ground equipment to warm oil and coolant before engine start. Cockpit heating systems received attention to prevent instrument freezing and improve pilot comfort during long patrols. Some units modified gun sight systems, replacing American optical sights with Soviet-produced equivalents that pilots found more intuitive. Control stick grip configurations were occasionally changed to match Soviet preferences. Throttle quadrants and mixture controls were sometimes modified to standardize operation with Soviet training procedures. The autonomy Soviet ground crews exercised in making these modifications contrasted sharply with American maintenance practices. U.S. Army Air Forces technical orders required strict adherence to factory specifications. Field modifications required engineering analysis and formal approval through technical order amendments processes that could take months. Soviet units could implement and evaluate changes within days or weeks, rapidly optimizing aircraft configuration for combat conditions. Guards Captain Alexander Pokryshkin became the second historian Soviet ace of the war with 59 confirmed victories, 47 achieved, while flying P-39 Airacobras. His tactical innovations transformed Soviet fighter operations and maximized the P-39's effectiveness. Pokryshkin had accumulated approximately 20 victories flying Soviet-built MiG-3 and Yak-1 fighters by early 1943, when his unit, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, converted to P-39s in January 1943. Pokryshkin approached the transition methodically. He studied the aircraft's technical characteristics, conducted extensive training flights, and analyzed how its capabilities could be exploited tactically. His most significant tactical innovation was the bookshelf formation, stacked altitude arrangement where fighters occupied different height bands, each layer supporting those below. In a typical four-aircraft bookshelf, the lowest pair flew at 3,000 to 4,000 meters, the second pair at 4,500 to 5,000 meters, a third pair at 5,500 to 6,000 meters, and a fourth pair at 6,500 to 7,000 meters. This vertical separation provided multiple tactical advantages. First, the stacked formation gave Soviet fighters flexibility in engaging German formations approaching from various altitudes. If German fighters appeared above the formation, the top layer could engage immediately, while lower layers maneuvered to support if Germans approached from below. The lowest layer engaged, while upper layers prevented German fighters from gaining altitude advantage. Second, the formation provided defensive depth. If German fighters attacked one layer, adjacent layers could rapidly reinforce, creating local numerical superiority. This principal concentration of force at a decisive point was fundamental to Soviet military doctrine and applied equally to air combat. Third, the vertical separation allowed each pair to perform specific tactical roles. Lower pairs typically carried more ammunition in full fuel loads, optimized for sustained combat. Higher pairs might fly with reduced fuel to decrease weight and maximize climb performance, serving as high-altitude scouts and quick reaction elements. Implementing the bookshelf formation required precise radio communication impossible for Soviet units before receiving P-39SE. Pokryshkin's pilots used radio to maintain formation discipline, adjust altitude spacing based on tactical situations, and coordinate attacks. The SER-522 radio's reliability made these coordinated tactics practical for the first time in Soviet fighter operations. Pokryshkin also pioneered ground-controlled interception using Soviet radar systems. The Red Army deployed its first mobile radar stations, designated RUS-2, to the Kuban front in summer 1942. These truck-mounted sets could detect aircraft formations at ranges up to 120 kilometers under ideal conditions. Pokryshkin established procedures for radar controllers to vector fighter formations toward German raids. Before visual contact, the integration of radar warning, radio communication, and coordinated fighter formations created a defensive system that German pilots found increasingly difficult to penetrate. Rather than encountering scattered, uncoordinated Soviet fighters, Luftwaffe formations faced well-positioned defensive patrols that appeared to anticipate their arrival. Soviet radar and radio coordination allowed exactly that. On April 9, 1943, Pokryshkin flew his first P-39 combat mission. His formation intercepted a German raid consisting of Bf-109 fighters attacking Soviet lag, -3 fighters near Kursk. Pokryshkin engaged Bf-109 at approximately 4,000 meters altitude, opened fire with all weapons at 250 meters range, and observed the Messerschmitt's engine explode. The German fighter rolled, inverted, and descended, trailing smoke, Pokryshkin claimed his first P-39 victory. 3 days later, on April 12th, Pokryshkin claimed for Bf-109s destroyed in a single engagement. His flight intercepted a German fighter formation at 5,000 meters altitude. Using radio coordination, Pokryshkin directed his wingmen to engage specific targets while he attacked from optimal position. The Soviet formation maintained altitude advantage throughout the engagement, preventing German fighters from establishing favorable geometry. Pokryshkin personally claimed 4 victories. His flight claimed 7 total without loss. Between April 9th and April 30th, 1943, Pokryshkin claimed 12 confirmed victories flying the P-39. His success demonstrated that the aircraft, properly employed with coordinated tactics and radio communication, could dominate German opposition. On April 29, 1943, Pokryshkin led 8 P-39s against a major German strike force, 3 squadrons of Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, escorted by approximately 20 Bf-109 fighters. Soviet radar detected the formation while still 60 kilometers from Soviet lines. Ground controllers vectored Pokryshkin's formation to intercept from an altitude advantage. The Soviet fighters attacked from 6,000 meters, diving through the German formation. 2 P-39s engaged the Bf-109 escort, while 6 concentrated on the street. The bomber formation broke apart under attack. Pokryshkin made multiple firing passes, claimed 5 Stukas destroyed, and reported an additional 7 destroyed by his flight. German records confirm heavy losses during this engagement, though exact numbers differ from Soviet claims, a common discrepancy in combat reporting. Pokryshkin received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award on May 24, 1943, and again on August 24, 1943. He received the award a 3rd time on August 19, 1944, becoming one of only 3 Soviet pilots to receive this distinction 3 times during the war. In June 1943, Pokryshkin was promoted to major and given command of a squadron. He received P-39 in serial number 100, which he marked with large white numerals 100 on the fuselage. He flew this aircraft for the remainder of the war. The number became his radio call sign Satka 100, and German radio operators learned to recognize it. Luftwaffe units reportedly received orders to avoid combat when intelligence indicated Pokryshkin was airborne. Unprecedented recognition of a single enemy pilot's effectiveness. Guard Senior Lieutenant Grigoriy Rechkalov achieved 56 confirmed victories, flying primarily P-39, making him the 4th highest-scoring Soviet ace. His career illustrates both the aircraft's potential and the challenges Soviet pilots faced in sustained combat operations. Rechkalov began the war flying obsolete I-16 and I-153 biplane fighters. On July 26, 1941, his I-16 was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a ground attack mission. Wounded in the right leg, Rechkalov managed to return to Soviet lines and crash-land his damaged fighter. Surgeons saved his leg, but Rechkalov spent 8 months recovering from his wounds and subsequent infections. He returned to operational flying in April 1942. Assigned to the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, the St. Unit, Pokryshkin served in Rechkalov, flew various Soviet fighters throughout 1942, achieving modest success with 4 solo victories and 2 shared kills by year's end. When the regiment converted to P-39s in January 1943, Rechkalov's effectiveness increased dramatically. Flying as Pokryshkin's wingman, Rechkalov learned coordinated tactics and radio communication discipline. Between January and May 1943, he claimed 12 solo victories and 2 shared, all flying P-39 SC. Rechkalov had one significant deficiency that should have disqualified him from fighter pilot service. He suffered from red-green color blindness. This condition, typically detected during medical screening, affects the ability to distinguish certain colors potentially critical for identifying aircraft markings or ground targets. Rechkalov concealed his condition throughout training and the early war by memorizing eye charts and positioning himself to observe other pilots' responses during color discrimination tests. His color blindness may have contributed to one significant tactical error. On May 31, 1944, Rechkalov's flight was vectored toward a reported German formation. Rather than maintaining formation discipline and awaiting tactical coordination, Rechkalov broke formation to pursue contacts he had visually acquired. His four wingmen followed. The Soviet fighters encountered a numerically superior German formation. Estimates suggest 15 to 20 FW-190 and Bf-109 fighters. In the resulting engagement, 5 of 6 Soviet P-39s were shot down. Only Rechkalov survived, his aircraft heavily damaged but controllable enough to reach Soviet lines. This engagement highlighted persistent problems in Soviet fighter operations despite improved equipment and tactics. Individual pilots sometimes reverted to aggressive but poorly coordinated attacks, sacrificing the tactical advantages that radio communication and formation discipline provided. The losses on May 31, 1944 represented the 16 Cards Fighter Aviation Regiment's worst single engagement casualties since converting to P-39 SE. Despite this setback, Rechkalov continued accumulating victories. He flew 452 combat sorties and participated in 122 aerial engagements during the war. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award twice, on May 24, 1943 and July 1, 1944. Rechkalov flew primarily to P-39 aircraft for extended periods. His first long-term mount was P-39K, serial number 428747, which he flew from early 1943 through mid-1944. His second primary aircraft was P-39 Kakinzi, serial number 442547, flown from mid-1944 through war's end. He marked both aircraft with his initials RGA painted on the tail. Soviet ground crews maintained these aircraft with particular care, recognizing that a successful ace was valuable both for morale and military effectiveness. Rechkalov survived the war, unusual for Soviet fighter pilots who flew throughout the conflict. He graduated from the Soviet Air Force Academy in 1951, held various command positions, and reached the rank of Major General of Aviation in 1959. He retired from active service in 1959 and died December 20th, 1990, at age 70. His memoirs, published in the 1980s, provide valuable first-hand accounts of P-39 operations. Rechkalov consistently praised the aircraft's firepower, radio communications, and structural strength. He noted that the P-39 could absorb substantial battle damage and remained flyable, critical for pilot survival when operating over enemy territory. The Kuban campaign of April-September 1943 provided the first large-scale test of Soviet fighter units equipped with P-39 Airacobra. This prolonged air battle over the Kuban Peninsula in southern Russia saw intensive combat between Soviet Air Force units and Luftwaffe formations supporting German ground forces. German objectives centered on maintaining the Kuban bridgehead salient northwest of the Caucasus Mountains that provided a launching point for renewed operations towards Soviet oil fields at Baku and Grozny. Soviet forces sought to eliminate this bridgehead and secure the entire Caucasus region, air superiority proved critical for both sides' ground operations. The Luftwaffe concentrated substantial forces for Kuban operations. Flieger Corps 1 deployed approximately 400 aircraft, including Bf-2-109 and Fw-190 fighters, Ru-87 Stuka dive bombers, and Ru-88 medium bombers. These forces operated from well-established airfields with good logistic support. Soviet forces initially deployed approximately 300 fighters, including P-39 Airacobra South, Yak-7 South, and La GG-3S. The 4th Air Army, responsible for air operations in the Kuban sector, included several regiments equipped with Airacobras, including Pokryshkin's 16 Gars Fighter Aviation Regiment. Combat operations began intensively in April 1943. German forces launched major ground attacks supported by heavy airstrikes. Soviet fighters flew multiple sorties daily, intercepting German bombers and engaging fighter escorts, the tactical pattern that would characterize the entire campaign emerged quickly. German formations approached at medium altitudes, 3,000 to 5,000 meters. Soviet fighters intercepted using radar warning and radio coordination, and intense turning combat ensued over the front lines. P-39 units demonstrated advantages that other Soviet fighters lacked. The reliable radio communication allowed coordinated interceptions that consistently achieved favorable tactical geometry. Soviet formations could concentrate multiple pairs against isolated German elements, achieving local numerical superiority even when outnumbered overall. The heavy firepower proved decisive in combat. German pilots reported that P-39s only needed brief firing opportunities to inflict critical damage. 1 or 2 37mm shells could destroy a fighter's engine or sever control surfaces. Against unarmored Stukas, a single 37mm hit often caused catastrophic structural failure. Soviet records claim approximately 1,200 German aircraft destroyed over the Kuban between April and September 1943. German records acknowledge substantially lower losses, approximately 400 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. This discrepancy, typical in air combat reporting, reflects both overclaiming in the heat of battle and different criteria for categorizing losses. What remains undisputed is that Luftwaffe operations over the Kuban became increasingly costly. German fighter units that had achieved favorable exchange ratios against Soviet aircraft in 1941-42 found themselves achieving roughly equal exchange rates by mid-1943. Parity represented a significant shift in the Eastern Frontier War. On May 24, 1943, multiple Soviet fighter pilots received Hero of the Soviet Union awards based on their Kuban operations. Both Pokryshkin and Rechkalov received the decoration on this date, recognition of their success flying P-39 SC. German tactical responses evolved throughout the campaign. Initially, Luftwaffe fighters attempted aggressive pursuit of Soviet formations, confident in their equipment and training advantages. These tactics produced diminishing returns as Soviet coordination improved. By June 1943, German fighters increasingly avoided engagement unless they held clear altitude or numerical advantages. Some Luftwaffe units attempted to exploit the P-39's known weaknesses, particularly its relatively poor performance above 6,000 meters. German fighters would climb to 7,000 to 8,000 meters before attacking Soviet formations from above. However, Soviet formations typically operated with sufficient altitude spacing that upper elements could engage German fighters before they reached optimum attack positions. The Kuban campaign established patterns that would persist through 1944-45. Soviet P-39 units operated effectively when provided radar warning, radio coordination, and competent ground control. German units achieved success when they could isolate individual Soviet fighters or catch formations at altitude disadvantages. Combat between coordinated formations typically resulted in roughly equal losses on both sides. The divergent outcomes of P-39 operations in American versus Soviet service resulted primarily from doctrinal differences. Rather than pilot quality or mechanical variations between aircraft, United States Army Air Forces fighter doctrine in 1942-43 emphasized individual initiative and aggressive pursuit of targets. This approach reflected American military culture's focus on individual skill, decentralized decision-making, and offensive action. Pilots were trained to identify targets of opportunity, engage aggressively, and press attacks until achieving decisive results or running low on ammunition and fuel. This doctrine worked effectively in aircraft with substantial performance margins fighters that could accelerate rapidly, climb quickly, and disengage from unfavorable tactical situations. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and heavy armament, could enter combat aggressively and use superior speed to disengage if threatened. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its turbocharged engine and rugged construction, could dive away from threats or climb to safety. The P-39, lacking these performance margins, exposed pilots who fought aggressively. American pilots in the Pacific who pursued Japanese fighters at high altitude found themselves unable to disengage when threatened. The aircraft's mediocre climb rate and poor high-altitude performance meant that aggressive pursuit could place pilots in situations where retreat was impossible. Soviet fighter doctrine in 1941-42 suffered from opposite problems. Rigid, centralized control left pilots with minimal tactical flexibility. Flight leaders made all tactical decisions. Wingmen were expected to follow without initiative. Radio silence prevented adaptation to changing situations. This approach produced catastrophic results during the German invasion when Soviet fighters encountered well-coordinated Luftwaffe formations. By 1943, Soviet doctrine had evolved significantly. The concept of para-pair became fundamental to fighters operating as a coordinated team, with radio communication allowing constant information exchange. Pairs could combine into 4-aircraft flights, Zvino, and flights into 8-aircraft formations. Achich, level coordination rather than individual initiative provided tactical effectiveness. This doctrinal framework matched the P-39's capabilities precisely. The aircraft's performance characteristics rewarded formation discipline, maintaining altitude advantage, coordinating attacks through radio communication, and concentrating firepower through multiple aircraft engaging single targets. The reliable radio made Soviet coordination possible in ways that had been impossible with domestic fighters. Soviet pilots were trained specifically to exploit these advantages. Rather than emphasizing individual combat skills, training focused on maintaining formation position, coordinating attacks through radio calls, and supporting wingmen. Pilots who excelled at individual maneuvering but broke formation discipline were disciplined or removed from combat units. American fighter training emphasized individual skill development, gunnery, aerobatics, instrument flying, and air combat maneuvering. These were valuable skills, but they prepared pilots for individual combat rather than coordinated formation tactics. American pilots in P-39 tried to apply individual skills in an aircraft that lacked the performance to make those skills decisive. the maintenance and modification approaches also differed fundamentally. American technical orders required strict adherence to factory specifications. Any modification required formal engineering analysis, testing, and approval through technical order amendment processes that could take months or years. This approach ensured safety and standardization but prevented rapid optimization for specific operational conditions. Soviet ground crews possessed significant autonomy to modify aircraft based on operational feedback. The removal of wing guns, adjustment of control cable tensions, and modification of weapon systems all occurred at unit level without formal engineering approval. These changes were documented informally, if at all, implemented based on pilot requests and mechanic judgment. This flexibility allowed Soviet units to optimize P-39s for Eastern Front conditions rapidly. The aircraft that entered combat in April 1943 differed in significant details from factory-fresh examples. These modifications collectively improved the aircraft's suitability for its tactical employment. The lesson extends beyond the specific case of the P-39. Military equipment effectiveness depends on the tactical environment, doctrine governing employment, and organizational culture surrounding maintenance and modification. The same equipment can fail in one context and succeed in another, not because the equipment changed, but because the surrounding system changed. German Air Force intelligence officers struggled to understand why Soviet fighter effectiveness increased sharply in mid-1943. Luftwaffe units had dominated Eastern Front air operations since the invasion began in June 1941. By late 1943, that dominance had eroded significantly. German after-action reports from Kuban and Ukrainian operations in 1943-44 noted several consistent patterns. Soviet fighters appeared to anticipate German formations' arrival, achieving favorable positioning before visual contact. This suggested radar warning. Though German intelligence was uncertain whether Soviet radar technology had advanced sufficiently for effective ground-controlled interception, Soviet fighters operated in well-coordinated formations that maintained discipline during combat. German pilots reported difficulty isolating individual Soviet aircraft as they had routinely accomplished in 1941-42. Soviet formations seemed to communicate constantly, adjusting tactics in response to German maneuvers. American-built fighters appeared frequently in contact reports. German pilots noted fighters with distinctive profiles, mid-mounted wings, bubble canopies, tricycle landing gear that differed from Soviet designs. These aircraft typically operated in coordinated groups, demonstrated good speed at medium altitudes, and carried heavy forward-firing armament. Several German intelligence assessments attempted to explain Soviet improvement. Some reports suggested that experienced Soviet pilots who had survived 1941-42 now led units and provided better tactical leadership. This was partially accurate, but incomplete pilot experience improved. But equipment quality improvements were equally important. Other assessments proposed that Lend-Lease aircraft were intrinsically superior to Soviet domestic fighters. This explanation satisfied some German analysts who preferred to attribute Soviet success to American industrial capacity rather than Soviet tactical competence. However, German technical intelligence officers who examined captured P-39s found them mechanically similar to aircraft that had failed in American and British service. What German analysis largely missed was the systemic integration of radio communication, radar warning, coordinated tactics, and field modifications. These elements combined to produce tactical effectiveness greater than any single component suggested. Luftwaffe tactical responses evolved throughout 1943–44. Some units adopted more defensive postures, avoiding engagement with Soviet formations unless holding clear advantages. This represented a significant shift from the aggressive tactics that had characterized Luftwaffe operations in 1941–42. Other Luftwaffe units attempted to counter Soviet coordination advantages through their own enhanced radio discipline and formation tactics. Some German fighter units achieved success with these approaches, particularly when equipped with late-model B fighters that maintained performance advantages over P-39s at all altitudes. However, by 1944, Luftwaffe fighter strength on the Eastern Front had decreased significantly. Large numbers of fighters were withdrawn for defense of the Reich against Allied strategic bombing. The units remaining in the East faced increasingly unfavorable numerical odds. Soviet records claimed that by mid-1944, VVS Soviet Air Force fighter units were achieving favorable exchange ratios against Luftwaffe opponents. German records acknowledge increasing losses, but attribute them primarily to numerical inferiority rather than Soviet tactical or technical advantages. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. Soviet equipment and tactics had improved substantially, while German numerical strength had decreased. Several prominent Luftwaffe aces were killed on the Eastern Front in 1944–45, fighting Soviet opponents. While not all these losses involved P-39s specifically, the overall pattern indicated that the Luftwaffe's earlier dominance had ended. Soviet Air Force had achieved rough parity in equipment quality while maintaining significant numerical superiority. Comprehensive assessment of P-39 combat effectiveness in Soviet service requires analyzing both quantitative data and qualitative outcomes. The statistics present a complex picture affected by reporting overclaiming and varying record-keeping standards. The Soviet Union received 4,719 P-39 Airacobras through Lend-Lease between 1941 and 1945. This represented nearly half of total P-39 production, approximately 9,600 aircraft manufactured. An additional 3,000 or so served the U.S. forces, with the remaining production allocated to training, testing, and foreign military sales. Soviet records indicate that 1,030 P-39s were lost to all causes between 1942 and 1945. For 9 lost in 1942, limited deployment, 305 lost in 1943, intensive combat operations over Kuban and Ukraine, 486 lost in 1944, peak combat intensity as Soviet forces advanced westward. 190 lost in 1945, reduced intensity as war concluded. These figures include losses to combat, accidents, mechanical failures, and operational attrition. The loss rate of approximately 22% over 3 years of intensive operations compares favorably to other aircraft types in similar service. Soviet victory claims attributed to P-39 pilots total approximately 2,500 to 3,000 individual aircraft destroyed. These figures require careful interpretation. Soviet confirmation procedures required either ground witness verification or gun camera confirmation when available. However, multiple pilots engaging single targets often resulted in multiple claims for single German losses. Analysis of German loss records suggests that Soviet overclaiming occurred at rates of approximately 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, typical for air combat during this period, if accurate. This would suggest approximately 1,000 to 1,500 confirmed German aircraft destroyed by Soviet P-39 This ratio of roughly 1.5 to 1 in favor of the P-39 represents substantial improvement over early war Soviet fighter operations when exchange ratios were 1 to 1 or worse. Individual pilot statistics provide additional perspective. At least 20 Soviet pilots scored 20 or more victories while flying primarily P-39s. The highest-scoring Soviet aces and their P-39 victories include Alexander Pokryshkin, 47 of 59 victories in P-39s, Grigoriy Rechkalov, 44 of 56 victories in P-39s, Nikolai Gulaev, 32 of 57 victories in P-39s, Dmitry Glinka, approximately 45 of 50 victories in P-39s, Alexander Klubovi, 31 of 50 victories in P-39s. This concentration of high-scoring aces in P-39 units was not coincidental. The aircraft's capabilities, particularly its radio communication, enabled the coordinated tactics that successful pilots employed. By comparison, only one American pilot became an ace while flying the P-39, Second Lieutenant William Fiedler, with 5 victories. This dramatic difference, one American ace versus dozens of Soviet aces. The last P-39 aerial victory in Europe occurred on May 9, 1945. Soviet Captain Vaz, flying an Airacobra, intercepted and destroyed a German Focke-Wulf FW-189 reconnaissance aircraft over Prague. Hours later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The aircraft that Western air forces had written off as obsolete scored the final aerial victory of the European war. Ironically, the last Luftwaffe aerial victory also involved a P-39. On May 9, 1945, a German Mi-262 jet fighter shot down a Soviet P-39 over Bohemia. The pilot survived by parachute. This engagement symbolized the aircraft's service, present from the beginning of Lend-Lease operations to the final hours of the war, achieving success despite being outmatched by newer technology. Soviet P-39 units continued operations after the war's end. Some regiments maintained their Airacobras through 1948, using them for occupation duties, pilot training, and proficiency maintenance. The last operational Soviet P-39 regiment converted to jet fighters, Yak-15 or MiG-9 in 1949, ending 8 years of service. American military analysts conducted post-war assessments of Soviet P-39 operations, attempting to understand why an aircraft rejected by U.S. forces had achieved such success in Soviet service. These studies, some remaining classified until the 1990s, reached various conclusions. Some analysts emphasized tactical environment differences. Eastern Front combat occurred at altitudes where the P-39's performance was adequate. Pacific combat required high-altitude interception that exposed the aircraft's fundamental limitation. This explanation was accurate but incomplete, as it didn't fully explain why Soviet pilots achieved such high victory totals. Other assessments focused on Soviet tactics and coordination. The recognition that radio communication enabled formation, discipline, and coordinated attacks appeared in several studies. Some analysts noted that American fighter doctrine's emphasis on individual initiative worked against the P-39's characteristics, while Soviet emphasis on formation, coordination, aligned with the aircraft's capabilities. A few classified assessments suggested that German fighter opposition on the Eastern Front was qualitatively inferior to Japanese fighter opposition. In the Pacific or Luftwaffe opposition over Western Europe, German records contradicted this assumption. The Luftwaffe units on the Eastern Front included experienced pilots flying modern aircraft. The difference was not in German capability, but in Soviet improvement. Soviet pilot interviews conducted in the 1950s and 1960s consistently praised the P-39. Rechkalov stated in a 1955 interview, "Of course, our fighters quickly caught up with the German Air Force, but aircraft like the P-39Q were well balanced for air combat. The most important advantage, in my opinion, was the high-sensitivity radio. The radio on the Airacobra was able to communicate with flightmates in any situation as if talking on the phone next to each other." Other Soviet pilots emphasized different aspects. Some praised the heavy firepower, particularly the 37mm cannon's destructive capability. Others noted the sturdy construction and pilot protection, crediting the aircraft's armor for their survival after battle damage. The bubbled canopy's excellent visibility received consistent praise, as did the ergonomic cockpit layout. Comparison with Soviet domestic fighters provided additional context. The Yakovlev Yak-3, introduced in 1944, was lighter and more maneuverable than the P-39. The Levakin La-5Ev and Lase, also introduced in 1944, had superior climb rates and similar speed. However, none matched the P-39's combination of firepower, radio reliability, and structural strength. Soviet ace Ivan Kosidov, the highest-scoring Allied ace with 62 victories, flew exclusively Soviet fighters, primarily Lo-5 and Alaska. His success demonstrated that domestic Soviet aircraft could achieve excellent results. However, Kosidov operated with specially maintained aircraft and had exceptional personal skill. The P-39 allowed average Soviet pilots to achieve good results through coordination and radio communication. The broader historical lesson concerns the relationship between military equipment and employment doctrine. The P-39 was not transformed by Soviet use. It remained mechanically identical to American examples. What changed was the tactical environment, doctrine governing employment, and organizational culture surrounding modification and optimization. Military organizations frequently reject equipment that fails in initial applications, assuming failure reflects inherent deficiencies rather than misapplication. The P-39 story demonstrates that equipment effectiveness depends on systemic factors, mission requirements, tactical doctrine, maintenance practices, and training emphasis. This lesson has relevance beyond World War II aviation. Modern military equipment programs sometimes fail not because the equipment is fundamentally flawed, but because employment doctrine doesn't match equipment capabilities. Conversely, equipment can succeed in contexts different from original design intent if doctrine and tactics adapt accordingly. The P-39's legacy in aviation history remains somewhat obscure. Western aviation literature typically dismisses it as a failure, focusing on its rejection by American and British forces. Soviet aviation literature recognizes its significance, but sometimes overstates its superiority to domestic fighters. The balanced assessment recognizes both perspectives. The aircraft failed when employed in roles it couldn't perform, and succeeded when employed in roles matching its capabilities. Museums preserve several P-39 examples, primarily in the United States and Russia. These aircraft represent different stages of production and different operational histories. Some Soviet veterans traveled to the United States in the 1990s to visit P-39s in museums, expressing nostalgia for an aircraft they credited with their survival and success. The P-39 Airacobra story is ultimately about context, adaptation, and the complex relationship between technology and doctrine. It succeeded magnificently in one context while failing completely in another. Same aircraft, same mechanical capabilities, vastly different outcomes. Understanding this complexity provides insight not just into World War II aviation, but into broader questions about how military organizations employ technology and adapt to changing operational requirements.